It starts out like any other voyage across the sea. A ship leaves port, the crew goes about their routines, and families wait for news of their safe arrival. Everything seems normal, almost ordinary. But in some cases, what begins as a simple journey turns into something far stranger. Because sometimes the people vanish, the ships drift aimlessly, and the ocean swallows every trace of the truth. Over the years, stories of ghost ships and unexplained disappearances have kept sailors awake at night and fascinated anyone who has ever looked out at the horizon. From the Valencia in 1906, to the Mary Celeste in 1872, to the mighty USS Cyclops in 1918, these mysteries are not just tales whispered over campfires, they really happened. Imagine finding a vessel floating silently on open water, her sails still set, her cargo untouched, but no one left alive on board. Or worse, imagine an entire ship sinking without a single scrap of wreckage ever surfacing. These are not legends or tall tales. They are real events, recorded in history, and each one reminds us that the ocean still holds the power to make even the largest, strongest ships disappear without warning. That's what makes these cases so haunting. If we can't explain them, then the sea remains undefeated. Its silence stronger than any human explanation. And tonight, as you listen, you'll drift through 12 of the most chilling maritime mysteries ever recorded. Each one a reminder that not all questions at sea find their answers. So just relax. No visuals are needed here. Let the sound of the story carry you. Let the mysteries unfold in your imagination, and allow the ocean's secrets to guide you gently into sleep. Let's start from SS Valencia. The SS Valencia began her life in 1882, not as a legendary ghost ship, but as an ordinary passenger steamer built for routine coastal service. She was a vessel of iron and wood, nearly 250 feet long, designed to carry people and cargo along the busy routes of the Pacific coast. By the time 1906 arrived, she had already seen over 2 decades of service, ferrying travellers between San Francisco, Seattle, and the ports in between. No one boarding her that cold January day would have guessed that their voyage would end in disaster, or that their ship would go on to haunt the waters of the Pacific Northwest for more than a century. On January 20th, 1906, the Valencia departed San Francisco bound for Seattle, with 108 people on board. The seas were rough that winter, but the crew and passengers had little reason to expect trouble. The Valencia had made the trip many times before, but by the night of January 22nd the weather began to close in. Heavy fog rolled across the Strait of Juan de Fuca as the ship approached the treacherous coastline of Vancouver Island. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The captain and crew navigated blindly, relying on their charts and instincts in a time before GPS and radar. Shortly after midnight, the Valencia struck a reef near Pachina Point. The impact ripped open her hull, and icy waves surged in. Panic spread as the ship listed, and the crew rushed to launch lifeboats. In the chaos, some lifeboats overturned before they even touched the water. Others were lowered without enough men to row them. Screams echoed in the darkness as waves crashed over the decks. For those who stayed aboard, the night became a nightmare of fear, freezing spray and despair. When morning broke, the Valencia was still pinned to the reef, battered by relentless surf. Survivors clung to the deck, staring helplessly toward the rocky shore just out of reach. Rescue ships were eventually dispatched, but the storm and the jagged coastline made it nearly impossible to get close. Witnesses from shore later recalled seeing desperate figures clinging to the rigging, waving frantically as wave after wave smashed against the crippled steamer. One by one, they disappeared into the sea. By the time the tragedy ended, only 37 people were alive. The rest, men, women, and children, had been lost to the Pacific. That alone would have been enough to make the Valencia infamous. But what happened afterward gave her a place among the most chilling maritime legends in history. In the years following the wreck, strange stories began to circulate. Fishermen reported seeing lifeboats drifting aimlessly, their oars gone, with what looked like skeletal figures still inside. Others claimed to hear the cries of drowning passengers on foggy nights, as if the echoes of their last moments were forever imprinted on the waves. Perhaps most unsettling were the repeated sightings of a ghostly steamer, its silhouette eerily resembling the Valencia, moving silently through the mist off Vancouver Island before vanishing without a trace. Locals began calling her the Phantom of the Pacific. The coastline where she was wrecked already had a grim reputation, It was known as the graveyard of the Pacific for the countless ships lost to storms, rocks, and treacherous waters. But the Valencia stood apart. She wasn't just another wreck. She was a ship that seemed to refuse to die, replaying her own tragedy again and again in the fog. Of course, there are explanations. Some historians argue that the ghostly sightings were nothing more than illusions, tricks of light, drifting debris mistaken for lifeboats, or other ships whose outlines happen to resemble the Valencia. Theories about the disaster itself are less mysterious. Many believe the captain miscalculated the ship's position in the heavy fog, steering too close to shore. Once she struck the reef, the combination of a violent storm and poor lifeboat handling sealed the fate of most passengers. From a logical standpoint, the Valencia's story was tragic but not supernatural, and yet the legend persists, even decades later. Long after the wreck had been swallowed by the sea, fishermen continued to tell of ghostly sightings in the area. Some claimed to see the ship sailing under full steam before dissolving into the fog. Others spoke of eerie cries drifting over the waves on still nights. Whether these were real experiences, exaggerated tales, or simply the haunting power of imagination, they became part of the Valencia's legacy. What makes the Valencia story so powerful is the combination of cold fact and chilling mystery. The disaster itself is well documented, one of the deadliest maritime tragedies in the Pacific Northwest. But the aftermath, those ghostly reports, the phantom ship, the skeleton-filled lifeboats, gave the story a life of its own. Even now, more than a century later, her name is spoken with a shiver by those familiar with the graveyard of the Pacific. The Valencia's wreck taught hard lessons about navigation, safety equipment and lifeboat procedures. But it also left behind something less tangible, a sense that the ocean doesn't easily let go of tragedy. Ships may sink, crews may be lost, but some stories linger, some tragedies echo. And off the coast of Vancouver Island, when the fog rolls in thick and the water is still, there are those who swear the SS Valencia is still out there, sailing forever as a ghost on the waves. Next, Mary Celeste, 1872, New York to Genoa. The Mary Celeste is perhaps the most famous ghost ship of all time, and her story begins on November the 7th, 1872. She was a merchant brigantine, 103 feet long, built to carry heavy cargo across the Atlantic. On this particular voyage, she left New York bound for Genoa, Italy. The ship was under the command of Captain Benjamin Briggs, a respected and deeply religious mariner with years of experience. Alongside him were his wife Sarah, their young 2-year-old daughter Sophia, and a crew of 7 hand-picked sailors. The Mary Celeste carried a valuable cargo of 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol. By all accounts, it was a normal commercial crossing. The vessel was sound, the crew was trusted, and the captain was not a man prone to mistakes. But less than a month later, everything about the Mary Celeste would turn into one of history's most enduring mysteries. On December 5th, 1872, another ship, the British brig Dei Gratia, was sailing off the Azores in the Atlantic when her crew spotted something strange drifting on the open water. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary vessel under sail. But as they drew closer, it became clear something was very wrong. The Mary Celeste was moving without direction, sails tattered, and no one could be seen on deck. When the boarding party from the Dei Gratia climbed aboard, they found the ship completely deserted. The scene was unnerving. The Mary Celeste was seaworthy, not sinking, and her cargo was almost entirely intact. 9 barrels were found empty, but the rest were in good order. The crew's belongings were undisturbed. Captain Briggs's cabin contained his personal effects neatly arranged, and charts still lay on the table. The ship's logbook, last updated on November 25th, gave no indication of trouble, just routine notes about position and weather. Even the galley told a chilling story. A half-eaten meal sat waiting, as if the crew had left suddenly in the middle of the day. The only thing missing was the lifeboat, suggesting the crew had abandoned ship. But why would they leave a perfectly sound vessel adrift in the middle of the Atlantic? Theories quickly multiplied. The most rational explanation offered at the time was that fumes from the industrial alcohol may have escaped from the barrels in the hold. If the crew smelled strong vapours or heard a small explosion, they might have feared the cargo was about to ignite. In a panic, Captain Briggs could have ordered everyone into the lifeboat temporarily. tethered to the Mary Celeste until the danger passed. But if the rope broke or the weather turned rough, the lifeboat could have drifted away, leaving the ship to sail on without them. This theory is logical, but it fails to explain why experienced sailors would abandon ship when there was no fire, no lasting damage, and plenty of provisions. Another possibility is a natural phenomenon. Some researchers have suggested a waterspout, a tornado over the ocean, could have drenched the deck and created the illusion that the Mary Celeste was sinking. In the chaos, Briggs might have believed his ship was doomed and evacuated. Again, it seems unlikely. The vessel was found in good condition, dry and stable. Others turned to darker ideas. Perhaps there had been a mutiny, with the crew turning against their captain. But there were no signs of struggle, no violence, and nothing missing of value. Piracy was another suggestion, but the cargo remained untouched, and no reports of pirate attacks matched the timeline, and then, of course, came the supernatural explanations. The 19th century was an age of superstition, and some sailors whispered that the Mary Celeste had fallen victim to forces beyond human understanding. Sea monsters, ghostly intervention, even alien abduction were whispered in taverns and ports. While these sound outlandish today, the sheer strangeness of the Mary Celeste made people reach for answers beyond the ordinary. What makes her story endure is not just the disappearance, but the silence. No distress signal was ever sent. No bodies were ever recovered. The crew, including a young child, simply vanished into the Atlantic, leaving behind a ship that was perfectly capable of completing its voyage. The Mary Celeste was eventually salvaged, repaired, and returned to service, but her reputation as a cursed vessel followed her to the end. Even her final years were suspicious. She was deliberately wrecked in an insurance fraud in 1885, sealing her fate as a ship forever tied to scandal and mystery. In the end, the truth of what happened aboard the Mary Celeste may never be known. Was it a panicked evacuation that went horribly wrong, a freak natural event mistaken for disaster, or something more sinister, a secret that was swallowed whole by the sea? More than 150 years later, her name still lingers in our collective imagination, a reminder that sometimes the ocean does not just sink ships, it erases people, leaving behind nothing but questions. Next, Carol A. Deering, 1921, Virginia to Rio de Janeiro. The Carol A. Deering was no ordinary schooner. Built in 1919, she was a 5-masted cargo vessel, over 250 feet long, built for the heavy work of transatlantic shipping. By the time of her mysterious end, she had already completed several long voyages and was considered a sturdy, dependable workhorse. In late 1920, she was tasked with hauling coal from Virginia to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, a routine voyage that many ships had made before. The captain originally assigned, William H. Merritt, fell ill before departure. He and his first mate disembarked in Delaware, leaving the vessel under the new command of Captain W. B. Wormel, a man known to be capable but also strict, with a reputation for clashing with subordinates. His first mate on this voyage was Charles McClellan, and tension between the two was reportedly high, even before the ship reached Brazil. Still, the Carol A. Deering successfully delivered her cargo, and on her return north she set sail once more into the Atlantic. That was the last time anyone would see the schooner under normal circumstances. On January 29th, 1921, the Deering was spotted by a lightship off Cape Lookout, North Carolina. A man on deck shouted through a speaking trumpet that the ship had lost her anchors, but strangely, the lightship keeper noticed that the crew seemed oddly out of place. He couldn't clearly identify the officers, and the man calling out appeared dishevelled. It was an unsettling encounter, but the vessel continued on her way. Just 2 days later, on January 31st, the Carol A. Deering was found hard aground on Diamond Shoals, off Cape Hatteras, an area infamous among sailors as part of the graveyard of the Atlantic. The Coast Guard boarded the vessel, and what they found was chilling. The ship was completely abandoned. No crew, no lifeboats, no personal belongings. The captain's logbook was missing, as well as navigational equipment and the ship's anchors, but otherwise the vessel was intact. In the galley, half-prepared meals still sat on the stove, and the crew's clothing and effects remained undisturbed. It was as if everyone had vanished in a hurry, never to return. The mystery deepened with each discovery. Unlike many abandoned vessels, there were no signs of violence or piracy. The cargo hold was empty, but that was expected. The Deering had already delivered her load of coal, So why would an experienced crew, led by a seasoned captain, abandon a perfectly sound ship so close to the safety of shore? Theories quickly multiplied. One suggestion was mutiny. The tension between Captain Wummel and his first mate was known, and some believed McClellan may have convinced the crew to turn against him. If so, perhaps the officers were overthrown, and the crew attempted escape in the lifeboats. But if they had fled, where did they go? No lifeboats were ever recovered, and no trace of the crew was ever found. Another theory pointed to piracy or rum runners. Prohibition was in full swing in the United States, and smugglers were active along the East Coast. Perhaps the Deering had been intercepted, the crew forced into lifeboats or killed, and the ship left adrift. Yet no evidence supported this idea. The ship was not looted, and her condition showed no signs of violent boarding. Some turned to nature for answers. The waters around Cape Hatteras are notorious for unpredictable storms, shifting sandbars and treacherous currents. Perhaps the crew believed the ship was about to founder and abandoned her in panic, only for the vessel to remain afloat after all. Still, seasoned sailors would have known better than to leave a stable ship for open lifeboats in rough seas. And then, inevitably, came the more sinister speculations. The Caroline Deering had sailed through the fringes of the Bermuda Triangle before her final grounding. Some claimed she was yet another victim of the Triangle's supposed anomalies, magnetic disruptions, strange forces, or even supernatural intervention. Others whispered of government conspiracies, noting that another ship, the SS Hewitt, also disappeared in the same region around the same time. Could both vanishings have been connected to secret experiments, smuggling operations, or something darker deliberately concealed from the public? Despite official investigations, the truth never surfaced. The Coast Guard concluded only that the Deering had been abandoned under mysterious circumstances. In the month that followed, wreckage of the schooner was battered apart by storms, leaving little behind but speculation and rumour. The families of the lost crew never received closure, and the fate of those men remains as uncertain today as it was in 1921. The Carroll A. Deering has since become one of America's most infamous ghost ships. She embodies all the elements of a perfect maritime mystery, a capable vessel, an experienced crew, a routine voyage that suddenly spiraled into silence. And like the Mary Celeste before her, she raises that haunting question. Why abandon safety for certain doom? Did mutiny drive the men to escape into the night? Did smugglers erase every witness to protect their trade? Or did the ocean itself claim them in ways we still cannot understand? More than a century later, the wreck of the Carroll A. Deering is gone, but her story drifts on. She remains a ghostly reminder that the sea does not give up its secrets easily, and sometimes the most ordinary voyage can end in the most extraordinary mystery. Next, Marine Sulphur Queen, 1963, Beaumont to Norfolk. The Marine Sulphur Queen was not the kind of ship built to inspire fear. Launched in 1944 as a T2 oil tanker, she was later converted into a specialised carrier designed to haul molten sulphur across long distances. By the early 1960s, she was one of the few vessels in service built for such a dangerous task. In February 1963, the Queen was loaded with over 15,000 tons of sulphur, heated to nearly 275 degrees Fahrenheit, a volatile cargo that required precision and a sturdy hull. Her crew of 39 men were all seasoned sailors, many of whom had worked on the ship before. On February 2nd, she departed Beaumont, Texas, bound for Norfolk, Virginia, on what was supposed to be another routine trip. What happened next is still one of the ocean's great puzzles. For 2 days, everything seemed normal. On February 4th, a routine position report was radioed in from near Key West. There was no sign of trouble, no indication that anything was wrong. And then, silence. That was the last transmission ever received from the Marine Sulphur Queen. When she failed to arrive in Virginia, the Coast Guard launched one of the largest search operations of its time, covering more than 350,000 square miles of ocean. Not a single survivor was found, not even the wreck of the ship itself. All that searchers recovered were a few pieces of life preservers, a single oil slick, and some scattered debris so ordinary it could have belonged to almost any vessel. A ship over 500 feet long, with 39 men aboard, had simply vanished into the sea without a trace. The lack of evidence made the case especially haunting. Usually when a ship goes down, there is at least something left behind. An overturned lifeboat, bodies washed ashore, large fragments of the hull. But here, there was nothing. Families of the crew clung to hope at first, waiting for news that the men might have survived on lifeboats. Yet no distress call had ever been sent, no flares fired, no sightings reported by other ships in the area. It was as though the Marine Sulphur Queen had simply ceased to exist. That eerie absence of answers fueled the first round of theories. The most straightforward explanation was structural failure. Even before the ship's disappearance, some sailors had expressed doubts about her condition. Converting an oil tanker into a sulphur carrier had introduced weaknesses. Sulphur's extreme heat and corrosive nature placed unique strain on the hull. Some believed cracks or fractures might have developed, leading to a sudden catastrophic break apart at sea. If the hull gave way, molten sulphur could have exploded into deadly steam and fire, overwhelming the crew in seconds before they could react. A disaster like that could sink a vessel quickly, leaving little wreckage. Others leaned toward the possibility of a massive explosion. Carrying so much molten sulphur, any rupture in the tanks could have triggered violent chemical reactions. One theory suggested that escaping sulphur gas may have poisoned the crew, disorienting them or even killing them before they could respond. A spark, even something as small as a static charge, might then have ignited the vapour, destroying the ship. If this happened at night, far from witnesses, it could explain why no distress call was ever made. But if it wasn't mechanical failure or an explosion, could nature itself have been to blame? The Florida Straits are known for sudden storms and rogue waves, giant walls of water that appear without warning and can smash even large vessels in an instant. If the Marine Sulphur Queen had already been weakened structurally, a single rogue wave might have been enough to finish her. Dragging her under so quickly the crew had no time to send out an SOS. And then, inevitably, the mystery was tied to the legend of the Bermuda Triangle. The Marine Sulphur Queen's last known position placed her on the edge of the infamous region, an area blamed for countless unexplained disappearances of ships and planes. Skeptics dismissed the idea as superstition, pointing instead to the ship's documented maintenance issues. But for others, the absence of wreckage and the silence of her last hours fit neatly into the triangle's eerie reputation. Could electromagnetic anomalies have disrupted her equipment? Did something stranger happen? Something beyond science's reach? In the end, the Coast Guard's official report stopped short of offering a definitive answer. They concluded that the most likely cause was structural failure due to the ship's condition and the dangerous nature of her cargo. But without wreckage, there was no proof. For the families of the 39 men, this was no comfort. Lawsuits followed, alleging negligence by the ship's owners, but no amount of litigation could explain how an entire vessel had disappeared without a single trace large enough to provide closure. Today, the Marine Sulphur Queen remains one of the most baffling maritime mysteries of the 20th century. A ship that carried fire in its belly, last seen sailing smoothly into the horizon, only to vanish completely 2 days later. Did her cargo ignite in a sudden inferno? Did her hull finally give way to years of stress? Or was she swallowed by something the ocean keeps hidden from us? More than 60 years later, the question remains unanswered. The sea took the ship, her crew, and the truth, and it hasn't given any of them back. Next, USS Cyclops, 1918, Brazil to Baltimore. The USS Cyclops was the kind of ship that seemed built to last forever. Commissioned in 1910, she was a massive naval collier, over 540 feet long and nearly 20,000 tons in weight. Her job was simple but essential, carrying coal and ore to fuel the Navy's ships around the world. She wasn't glamorous, but she was sturdy, practical, and considered one of the most reliable vessels in the fleet. By the time World War I was underway, she had already logged years of dependable service. She carried a crew of over 300, men who trusted that their ship could withstand just about anything the Atlantic might throw at them. In late February of 1918, the Cyclops set out from Brazil on a critical mission. She was heavily loaded with over 10,000 tons of manganese ore, an essential material for steel production and the war effort. After leaving Rio de Janeiro, she stopped in Barbados to refuel before beginning the final leg of her voyage to Baltimore, Maryland. Conditions seemed routine. The ship was known to have engine trouble, and she was operating with only one of her 2 engines, but the weather was reported as calm. There was no sign that this would be anything but a long but ordinary crossing of the Atlantic, and then she was gone. Somewhere between Barbados and Baltimore, the Cyclops vanished without sending a single distress signal. No SOS calls were received, no emergency flares were sighted. When she failed to arrive on schedule, a massive search began. Dozens of ships and planes scoured the shipping lanes, covering every mile of her intended route. But no debris was ever recovered, no bodies were found, no oil slicks, no floating wreckage, nothing. A ship of her size, carrying 306 people, had disappeared as if it had never existed at all. The sheer silence of the disappearance is what made it so terrifying. If the Cyclops had gone down in a storm, there should have been signs. Wreckage scattered across the sea, lifeboats adrift, cargo washing ashore. Instead, the Atlantic remained empty, offering no clues and no closure for the families waiting in Baltimore. That absence of evidence fueled a storm of theories. The most widely accepted explanation is structural failure. The Cyclops was heavily loaded with manganese ore, far more than her hull may have been designed to handle. Some reports suggest the ore wasn't evenly distributed, which could have created enormous stress on her frame. If her central support beam snapped, the ship might have broken apart and sunk in minutes, taking the entire crew with her. If that happened suddenly enough, it could explain why no SOS was ever sent. Another possibility is sabotage. In 1918, World War I was still raging, and German U-boats prowled the Atlantic. Some have speculated that the Cyclops was sunk deliberately by an enemy submarine or infiltrated by spies. Others have pointed to rumours of unrest aboard the ship, claims that her captain, George Worley, was unpopular with his crew and may have faced mutiny. Could the vessel have been deliberately sabotaged from within, her fate hidden to cover up the truth? Without evidence, these claims remain speculation. Nature, too, is a suspect. The Atlantic is home to rogue waves, towering walls of water that can reach over 100 feet high, powerful enough to break ships in half. If the Cyclops, already weakened by her cargo load and engine issues, encountered such a wave, she might have gone under so fast that no one had time to react. And then, of course, there is the legend of the Bermuda Triangle. The Cyclops disappeared within the region that would later become infamous for ship and plane vanishings. Some point to this as further proof of strange forces at work, magnetic anomalies, vortexes, or even otherworldly phenomena. Skeptics dismiss these ideas, arguing that the triangle is simply a busy shipping lane with unpredictable weather. But the fact remains, the Cyclops was one of the largest vessels ever lost in the area, and her disappearance became one of the foundational stories in building the triangle's eerie reputation. What makes the Cyclops case even stranger is what happened to her sisters. Two ships of the same class, the Proteus and the Nereus, also vanished years later under similarly mysterious circumstances. Both carrying heavy loads of ore, both lost without trace. Three nearly identical ships, all gone under the same eerie pattern. Coincidence? Or was there a hidden design flaw that doomed them all? For over a century, the fate of the USS Cyclops has remained one of the greatest mysteries in naval history. 306 men, a ship nearly the size of the Titanic, and a cargo critical to the war effort, all swallowed by the sea without leaving a clue. Did she break apart under the weight of her own load? Was she sunk by an enemy in wartime secrecy? Or did something more inexplicable claim her in the silent waters of the Atlantic? The truth may still lie on the ocean floor, hidden in the darkness of the deep. But until it's found, the Cyclops remains a ghost ship in memory, a symbol of how even the strongest vessel can vanish when the ocean decides to keep its secrets. Next, SS Edmund Fitzgerald, 1975, Lake Superior. The Edmund Fitzgerald was never just another freighter. When she was launched in 1958, she was the largest ship ever built for service on the Great Lakes, 720 feet long, sleek and powerful. She quickly earned the nickname Queen of the Lakes, hauling iron ore across Lake Superior from the mines of Minnesota to the steel mills of Detroit and beyond. For 17 years, she was a familiar sight on the inland seas, a vessel her crew took pride in, and one that most people believed was practically unsinkable. By November of 1975, the Fitzgerald had already completed dozens of successful runs. On the morning of November the 9th, she left Superior, Wisconsin, loaded with over 26,000 tons of taconite pellets. The destination was Zug Island near Detroit, a routine trip she had made countless times before. At her helm was Captain Ernest McSorley, a respected mariner nearing retirement, commanding a crew of 29. The weather forecast called for rough conditions, but storms were nothing new on Lake Superior. These were sailors who had spent their lives navigating the unpredictable waters of the Great Lakes. The storm that followed, however, was no ordinary squall. By the evening of November 9th, a full-blown gale had developed, with hurricane-force winds and towering waves pounding the lake. Another freighter, the Arthur M. Anderson, was travelling a similar route, staying in radio contact with the Fitzgerald as the storm intensified. Throughout the day of November 10th, conditions worsened. Waves reached up to 25 feet, winds gusted near 60 miles per hour, and snow squalls reduced visibility to almost nothing. The Fitzgerald was taking a beating. By mid-afternoon, Captain McSorley reported damage. Vents had been ripped away, water was washing over the deck, and the radar was lost. Yet his voice on the radio remained steady. At 7:10 p.m., he gave his final transmission to the Anderson. "We are holding our own," he said calmly. Minutes later, the Fitzgerald disappeared from radar. No distress call was ever sent. No flares were sighted. The ship had simply vanished beneath the storm. When rescue efforts began, the Anderson and Coast Guard vessels braved the storm to search for survivors. What they found was haunting. Lifeboats were located, but they were shattered, torn apart as if ripped open by incredible force. Pieces of debris and twisted metal were scattered across the water, but there were no bodies. The entire crew of 29 was gone. Days later, the wreck was discovered resting in two massive pieces on the lake bed, more than 500 feet down. The Fitz had gone down fast, taking everyone with her. What makes the Edmund Fitzgerald so chilling is not just the suddenness of her loss, but the fact that no one can agree on exactly what happened in those final minutes. Several theories have been put forward, each with its own disturbing implications. The most widely accepted explanation is shoaling. Lake Superior is dotted with hidden reefs and shallow ridges. Some investigators believe the Fitzgerald struck one of these as she tried to take shelter closer to the Canadian shore. The impact could have ruptured the hull, flooding her cargo hold until she finally gave way. Another theory points to structural failure. The Fitzgerald, while mighty, was already 17 years old and had a history of minor issues. Some suggest that repeated stress from storms and heavy loads may have weakened her hull. In the fierce conditions of November 10th, her frame might have simply buckled, breaking her in two. The fact that her wreckage was found in two massive pieces supports this grim possibility. Then there is the theory of the Three Sisters, a phenomenon unique to the Great Lakes. These are three rogue waves, each larger than the last, striking in quick succession. Survivors of other storms have described them as walls of water that can overwhelm even the largest freighters. If the Fitzgerald encountered such waves while already damaged and listing, they could have driven her under in seconds, too quickly for a distress call to ever be sent. Of course, with so many unanswered questions, speculation continues. Some point to lapses in safety regulations, noting that the Fitzgerald's lifeboats were old, her safety gear outdated, and her hull possibly overstressed by carrying cargo too deep in the water. Others insist the captain's decision to push through the storm was a tragic miscalculation, but none of these explanations bring closure. Not when no one knows the exact moment the ship gave way. The Edmund Fitzgerald has since become the most famous shipwreck in Great Lakes history, immortalised in song, legend and memorial. But behind the stories and the music is the brutal truth. 29 men vanished into the icy waters of Lake Superior without a chance to fight back. They were there 1 minute, gone the next, leaving behind only silence and speculation. Nearly 50 years later, the wreck still lies on the lake bed, preserved by the frigid water. It remains a grave for the crew, visited only by remote submersibles and divers on official expeditions. The bell of the Fitzgerald was raised in 1995 and now stands in a maritime museum as a tribute to the men who never came home. And yet the haunting question lingers. What really happened in those last minutes? Did a hidden shoal rip open the hull? Did her structure finally fail after years of strain? Or was she pulled under by waves so massive that no one on board could react? Until definitive proof is found, the Fitzgerald's fate will remain an unsolved mystery. One more reminder that even inland seas can be as merciless as the open ocean. Next, CAS 2, 2007, Australia. The CAS 2 was supposed to be the start of an adventure, not a mystery. In April of 2007, three friends, Derek Batten, age 56, and brothers Peter and James Tunstead, aged 69 and 63, set sail from Airlie Beach in Queensland, Australia. Their plan was modest, a leisurely journey up the coast to Townsville, before continuing along the shoreline toward Western Australia. All three were experienced sailors, familiar with the waters and comfortable with the risks of the open sea. The yacht itself, a 32-foot catamaran, was in good condition and well prepared for the trip. Nothing about the voyage suggested danger, but just days later the CAS 2 was found drifting like a ghost ship, and the men were never seen again. On April 18th, a surveillance aircraft spotted the vessel near the Great Barrier Reef, about 88 nautical miles off Townsville. It was moving with the wind, sails flapping loosely, with no one visible on deck. When authorities boarded the catamaran, they found a scene frozen in time. The engine was still running. A laptop sat open and powered on. Food was laid out in the galley, as if the men had stepped away from their meal. 3 life jackets were still on board, untouched. The men's wallets, passports and belongings were neatly stowed. The only thing missing was the crew. The eerie state of the yacht brought instant comparisons to the Mary Celeste more than a century earlier. Everything was in its place, but the sailors had vanished. Even the ship's logbook provided no clues beyond routine entries, the last dated April 15th, just 3 days before the vessel was discovered. No distress call had been made, no emergency beacons had been activated. The CAS 2 had been left to wander, perfectly seaworthy but eerily silent. Investigators launched an exhaustive search, scouring the seas for signs of the missing men. Helicopters, ships, and aircraft covered hundreds of miles of ocean. But no bodies, no lifeboats, no life rings were ever recovered. The 3 sailors had simply disappeared into the water, so what could have happened? The most common theory is what investigators called an overboard cascade. Perhaps one of the men fell into the water unexpectedly, while adjusting a sail perhaps, or leaning over the side. The others may have tried to save him, each in turn pulled into the sea by the effort. In this scenario, the yacht could have continued drifting without them, powered by wind and current, while its crew perished just out of reach. But skeptics point out that none of them grabbed life jackets or flotation devices, which experienced sailors would likely have done even in a moment of panic. Another theory centres around the fishing gear found trailing behind the yacht. Some speculate that one of the men was reeling in a catch and fell overboard in the struggle. The others, rushing to help, may have been dragged into the sea themselves. If the catamaran was still moving under sail, even at modest speed, it would have been nearly impossible to climb back aboard from the water. Still, this theory doesn't explain why no trace of them, no clothing, no debris, was ever found in the surrounding waters. A third explanation involves the weather. The region is notorious for sudden squalls, violent bursts of wind that can whip up without warning. If a squall had hit, perhaps while the men were adjusting the sails, the force could have knocked all 3 into the sea at once. The minor sail damage discovered on the CAS 2 supports the idea that rough weather may have played a role. But once again, there were no distress calls. And nothing about the condition of the vessel suggested catastrophic weather at the time it was found. And then there are the stranger speculations. Some whisper about foul play, piracy, criminal encounters, or even an intentional disappearance. Yet there was no sign of a struggle, no theft of valuables, and no evidence of outsiders ever boarding the vessel. Others reach for the supernatural, ghostly forces at sea, a modern echo of the same mysteries that have haunted sailors for centuries. The official investigation, conducted by the Queensland coroner, leaned toward the overboard cascade theory as the most likely explanation. But in truth, no one knows for certain. The CAS 2 was found in nearly perfect condition, its systems running, its crew gone as though they had been plucked from the deck. Today, the story of the CAS 2 is remembered as one of the most baffling maritime mysteries of the 21st century. A modern yacht, 3 experienced men, calm seas, and no clear reason why they vanished. Was it a simple accident that spiraled into tragedy? Or was something else at work, something the ocean keeps hidden? What makes the CAS 2 case so haunting is its ordinariness. This wasn't a century-old schooner or a vessel burdened with war cargo. It was a small yacht on a short trip, crewed by 3 friends enjoying their time on the water, and yet, like so many ghost ships before it, it drifts into legend. Another reminder that even in the age of GPS and satellite tracking, the sea can still swallow lives without leaving behind a single trace. Next, High Aim 6, 2003, Western Australia. The High Aim 6 was not a luxury liner or a passenger ship. It was a working vessel, a Taiwanese long-line fishing boat built for hard days at sea. By late 2002, it was operating out of Taiwan with a captain, a small crew, and the usual routine of heading out into deep waters in search of tuna and other valuable catches. Nothing about the voyage seemed unusual. The boat was seaworthy, the crew experienced, and its purpose clear. But in early 2003, the High Aim 6 would become one of the eeriest ghost ship cases of the modern era. On January 8, 2003, the vessel was spotted drifting near the coast of Western Australia. From a distance, everything seemed normal. The ship was upright, seaworthy, and in no immediate distress. But when authorities boarded her, they found a chilling scene. The entire crew had vanished. Inside, everything looked as though the men had only just stepped away. Fuel tanks were full, the engine was in working order, and supplies remained on board. There was no sign of fire, flooding, or a struggle. The galley still held provisions, and the ship was stocked for a long voyage. Yet not a single person remained aboard. What made the discovery even stranger was the timeline. The last confirmed contact with the High Aim 6 had been weeks earlier, in December 2002. Since then, the boat had continued on its course without reporting in. By the time it was intercepted near Australia, it had travelled hundreds of miles alone, crewless but still carrying on as if nothing had happened. Investigators found little in the way of evidence. No distress calls had been sent, no emergency beacons activated. Curiously, the ship's lifeboat was missing, as though the crew had abandoned ship. But if they had done so voluntarily, why? The vessel itself was perfectly capable of continuing its voyage. There was no immediate danger that would have forced them into open waters, and if they had fled, why were their personal belongings, food and equipment all left behind? The mystery of the High Aim 6 quickly gave rise to theories. The most straightforward explanation was mutiny. Perhaps tensions had boiled over between the captain and the crew, and the sailors had turned against him. In this version of events, they might have killed or ejected the captain and then fled in the lifeboat, leaving the ship adrift. But if so, what became of them? No lifeboat, no bodies, and no trace of the crew were ever found. Another possibility is tied to smuggling. Fishing boats in the Pacific have sometimes been used as cover for transporting illegal goods, and some speculate that the High Aim 6 might have been involved in something far more dangerous than fishing. In this theory, the crew could have been silenced or taken off the ship deliberately to conceal criminal activity. Yet again, there was no hard evidence. No contraband was ever found aboard. Others suggest a darker but simpler explanation: a sudden, unexplained disappearance at sea. Accidents happen. Men can be swept overboard, one by one, especially in the rough conditions. But for the entire crew to vanish without leaving even a single body or signal seems unlikely. And yet, when all other explanations fail, the ocean's vastness leaves room for possibilities no one can fully rule out. The supernatural theories, as always, linger on the edges of maritime lore. Some whisper that the High Aim 6 fell victim to the same forces blamed for other ghost ships. Strange phenomena, rogue waves, or even something paranormal that claimed the men while leaving the vessel untouched. Rational or not, these whispers only grew louder as the mystery deepened. In the end, the High Aim 6 was towed to shore, examined and eventually left behind as just another unsolved case in the long list of ghost ship stories. Its hull carried no answers. Its logbook gave no clues. Its condition offered no reason for abandonment. Only one fact remained clear. Sometime between December 2002 and January 2003, every man aboard disappeared, leaving behind a silent vessel drifting across the waves. And so the haunting question lingers. What happened to the men of the High Aim 6? Were they victims of mutiny, silenced by smugglers, or swallowed by forces no one can explain? The ship itself may have been found, but its crew has never returned. Next, MV Joyita, 1955, South Pacific. The MV Joyita began her life as a luxury yacht back in 1931, a sleek vessel designed for leisure and elegance. Over time, she changed roles, serving during World War II, then later converted into a hard-working cargo and passenger vessel in the South Pacific. By the mid-1950s, she had already gained a reputation as a tough, reliable ship, though some whispered that she also had a history of mechanical troubles. On October 3, 1955, she departed Apia, Samoa, bound for the Tokelau Islands, carrying 25 people on board, along with medical supplies and cargo. The voyage was expected to take just 2 days, but the Joyita never arrived. For weeks, search planes and ships scoured the Pacific, but no wreckage or survivors were found. Then, more than a month later, on November 10th, the mystery deepened. The Joyita was discovered adrift north of Fiji, listing heavily to one side but still afloat. From a distance, she looked battered but not destroyed, a vessel that should have been able to stay afloat until help arrived. When rescuers boarded her, however, they were met with a scene straight out of a nightmare. The ship was completely abandoned. The 25 people who had been on board were gone without a trace. The radio was tuned to the international distress frequency, yet no distress call had ever been received. Medical kits were found open with bloody bandages scattered about, as though someone had been injured in the hours before the disappearance. And while the Joyita herself was damaged, her cargo remained intact, untouched by looters or pirates. Even more unsettling, much of the equipment and navigational gear had been removed, along with the ship's lifeboats. It was as if the crew had fled, but the ship itself was still floating and capable of survival. Why would they have abandoned her? Theories quickly surfaced. Some investigators suggested that a pipe failure caused flooding in the engine room, and in the panic, the crew and passengers believed the ship was sinking. If they had abandoned ship prematurely, they may have been lost to the open ocean, while the Joyita, buoyant due to her cork-lined hull, remained afloat. But if that was the case, why didn't anyone return when the vessel clearly didn't go under? And why were there signs of injury before the evacuation? Others pointed to the possibility of piracy. Perhaps raiders had intercepted the Joyita, forcing the crew and passengers into lifeboats and leaving the ship adrift. Yet nothing valuable was missing. Her cargo of medical supplies and barrels of oil were all accounted for. Piracy seemed an unlikely explanation when the most obvious prize was left untouched. The darker theories suggested something more violent occurred on board. Maybe a mutiny, or a fight that spiraled out of control. The presence of bloody bandages gave fuel to this idea. Some believe a confrontation ended with the crew abandoning ship in fear, only to vanish forever into the Pacific. And then there are the whispers that circle all ghost ships, that perhaps the disappearance was not entirely natural. With no bodies, no lifeboats, and no evidence beyond a drifting vessel, some wonder if the Joyita's fate belongs to the same realm of unexplained maritime vanishings that the ocean guards so closely. In the end, the MV Joyita became known as the Pacific's Mary Celeste, another vessel found abandoned but intact, her people gone as though they had simply stepped off into the sea. What happened in those missing weeks remains unsolved. Were the 25 lost to a panicked evacuation, or were they the victims of something more sinister? The ship was found, but her crew never was, and so the question endures, echoing across the waters of the South Pacific. Next, Beichimo and Lyubov Orlova, drifting ghosts of the Arctic. Some ghost ships vanish without warning, others sink quickly, taking their secrets with them. But a few refuse to die, drifting for years, even decades, as if the ocean itself cannot quite let them go. Two of the strangest examples are the Beichimo, an Arctic trader from the early 20th century, and the Lyubov Orlova, a Soviet cruise liner turned modern ghost ship. The Beichimo was built in 1914 and worked for the Hudson's Bay Company, hauling furs and goods across the icy waters of northern Canada. In 1931, she became trapped in the Arctic ice, her crew forced to abandon her when conditions made it impossible to keep her afloat. Most expected her to be crushed and buried beneath the pack ice, but the Beichimo didn't sink. Instead, she slipped free, and for nearly 40 years she wandered the Arctic as a true ghost ship. Inuit hunters spotted her, passing explorers boarded her, and time after time she would drift back into view before vanishing again. Her final sighting came in 1969, 38 years after she had first been abandoned. To this day, no one knows where she finally came to rest. Did the ice eventually take her? Or is she still out there, preserved in some frozen corner of the Arctic? Fast forward to 2013, and the modern oceans gave us a ghost story of their own. The Lyubov Orlova was once a proud Soviet cruise liner, ferrying wealthy passengers through polar waters. But by the 2000s, she had fallen into disrepair, sold for scrap and being towed across the Atlantic. Then, in January 2013, the tow line snapped. The massive ship drifted away, lost to the open sea. At first, officials expected her to be found quickly, but instead the Lyubov Orlova slipped into legend. Radar blips hinted at her presence. Rumours swirled about infestations of starving rats feeding on one another to survive as the ship wandered unmanned across the North Atlantic. Newspapers nicknamed her a cannibal rat ghost ship, and for months stories claimed she might wash up on European or Canadian shores. Some believe she finally sank, swallowed by a storm. Others argue she's still out there, drifting quietly, waiting to appear without warning on some distant coastline. The Bechimo and Lyubov Orlova remind us of something unsettling. Not all ghost ships are lost in an instant. Some linger, shadows on the horizon, refusing to disappear. They become more than vessels, they become legends. And the haunting question remains, are they gone forever, or are they still out there, drifting just beyond sight, waiting to be found again? Next, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, 1845, Arctic Circle. The Arctic has always been a place where human ambition meets the harshest reality. Endless ice fields, plunging temperatures, and months of darkness make it one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. Yet in the 19th century, Britain believed it could conquer the unknown. In May of 1845, two proud ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, set sail from England with a single mission: to find the fabled Northwest Passage, a sea route through the Arctic that could link the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The expedition was led by Sir John Franklin, a seasoned explorer who had already charted parts of the Canadian North. His two vessels had been built for war but were refitted for exploration. Their hulls were reinforced with iron, steam engines installed to power through calm waters, and the holds were packed with 3 years of provisions. On board were 129 men, scientists, sailors, and officers, all confident that this voyage would secure their names in history. It was a symbol of Britain's power, its dominance at sea, and its determination to push the boundaries of discovery. When the Erebus and Terror left Greenhithe that May, families waved them off with pride, never imagining it would be the last time they were seen alive. The expedition's first month seemed promising. The ship stopped in Greenland to resupply, sending back cheerful letters and reports. They were last sighted by passing whalers in Baffin Bay in late July of 1845, heading west into the unknown. After that, silence. The men had vanished into the ice. Britain waited. Months passed, then years, and no word ever came. By 1848, concern turned to panic. The Admiralty launched search missions, scouring the Arctic seas for any trace of Franklin's fleet. At first, nothing was found. But then, scattered clues began to surface. Inuit communities told haunting stories of starving white men dragging sledges across the snow. They spoke of gaunt figures wandering aimlessly, some resorting to the unthinkable in their desperation. Years later, these accounts would be confirmed when skeletal remains were recovered, scarred with cut marks consistent with cannibalism. The greatest discovery of all came in 1859. A search party stumbled upon a stone cairn on King William Island. Inside was a single note, written in a clear but desperate hand. It revealed the horrifying truth. The Erebus and Terror had been trapped in ice since September of 1846, locked in place for over a year and a half. Franklin himself had died in June 1847, leaving command to Captain Crozier. By April of 1848, with provisions running low and no sign of release, the surviving men had abandoned the ships and set out on foot. Their plan was to march south in hopes of reaching safety. The note ended with a chilling final detail. 105 men remained alive at that moment. None would ever make it back. For decades, the fate of the Franklin expedition was one of the great maritime mysteries. Searchers found more bones, more scraps of equipment, but never the ships themselves. It was as though the Arctic had swallowed them whole. Meanwhile, Inuit testimony painted a disturbing picture of the final days. Emaciated men staggering through blizzards, collapsing in the snow, their faces hollow with hunger and despair. In the 1980s and 1990s, forensic teams examined remains and found something even more unsettling. The bones contained abnormally high levels of lead. Many now believe the tinned food supplied for the expedition was sealed with lead solder, poisoning the men slowly, clouding their judgment, and weakening their bodies until survival became impossible. And yet, even knowing this, the mystery was not complete. Where were Erebus and Terror? For nearly 170 years they remained lost, their hulks hidden beneath Arctic waters. That changed in 2014. The Canadian search team finally located HMS Erebus in Victoria Strait, lying on the seabed in relatively shallow water. Remarkably intact, her structure still held strong despite nearly 2 centuries beneath the waves. 2 years later, in 2016, the sister ship HMS Terror was discovered in Terror Bay, preserved in even better condition. The cabins were still arranged, dishes left neatly on shelves, journals waiting in drawers. It was like stepping back into 1848, as if the crew had only just walked away. The discoveries solved one mystery. The ships had not drifted far from where they were abandoned, but they raised new questions. Why had the crew not returned to the ships when it became clear marching across the ice was hopeless? Why had no attempt been made to use the vessels as refuges until rescue arrived? Some believe the men were too weak from scurvy and lead poisoning to consider it. Others suggest they were driven by desperation, clinging to the hope that moving south was their only chance. And still, whispers of darker possibilities remain. Inuit testimony described the survivors as behaving strangely, speaking incoherently, stumbling like men possessed. Was this only the effect of lead poisoning, or something more elusive, some psychological collapse triggered by months of isolation and endless ice? Some even suggest the Franklin expedition may have fallen victim to a kind of Arctic hysteria, a breakdown of the mind brought on by an environment so alien and unyielding that reason itself begins to erode. More speculative voices point to the sea itself. Rogue waves, shifting ice flows, and violent storms may have damaged the ships beyond use long before they sank. Others lean into the supernatural, suggesting that perhaps Erebus and Terror became cursed relics the moment they entered those frozen waters. After all, their very names, Erebus, the Greek god of darkness, and Terror, read now like grim foreshadowing. Even with both wrecks located, Erebus and Terror remain among the most haunting ghost ships of all time. Their timbers still rest beneath the Arctic, perfectly preserved, silent witnesses to the suffering of 129 men who never came home. The wrecks are now protected, carefully studied by divers and archaeologists, but the final days of Franklin's men remain shrouded in mystery. How far did they march before the cold took them? Who was the last to fall? Did they ever believe rescue was coming? The Franklin expedition was meant to be a triumph of exploration, but it ended as one of history's greatest maritime tragedies. Today, Erebus and Terror stand as stark reminders of the Arctic's power. Even with the finest ships of their age, with iron hulls and steam engines with supplies for years, human ambition was no match for ice and silence. And so, the question lingers. Haunting across time, when the last survivors stumbled into the endless white, frostbitten and starving, what thoughts went through their minds? Did they cling to hope? Or did they already know the truth, that the Arctic was their tomb, and that Erebus and Terror would drift into legend as ghost ships for generations to come? Some ships vanished without warning, swallowed whole by the sea. Others drifted on for decades, aimless and silent, as if unwilling to surrender. A few reappeared in impossible places, their crews gone, their cabins frozen in time. Yet not one of these stories is fully explained. Even now, with sonar mapping the ocean floor and satellites tracking ships across the globe, mysteries remain. A century passes, sometimes two, and still no answers emerge. The ocean has a way of keeping its secrets, reminding us that for all our progress we're still small when set against its silence. So tonight, let that silence accompany you. Imagine the waves lapping against empty decks, the creak of rigging on a ship that no longer has a crew, and the endless horizon hiding questions that no one has yet solved. And if you'd like more mysteries whispered in the dark, stories that drift between history and legend. Subscribe and let the sea carry you back here again.